Today is Thursday, January 11th, 2023. I'm Rob Gaudet, and this is Disinfowars, a series that's part of Ukraine War Brief aimed at helping our audience become savvier news consumers, because, whether you're aware of it or not, Russia is targeting you. This is episode 1, where I'll be briefing you on a matter critical to the war in Ukraine: former US President Donald Trump's absolute immunity claim from prosecution. I'll walk through Trump's position on Ukraine, Russia's continued interference in US politics, the abject failure of mass media to cover those topics in a way that adequately protects democracy, and, while I'm at it, translate legalese into plain English. Inspired by countries that border Russia, you'll learn exactly what Russia doesn't want you to know. Let's get started. Former US President Donald Trump was indicted by a federal grand jury and special counsel Jack Smith on August 1st, 2023, and charged with 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, 1 count of obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and 1 count of conspiracy against rights for his role in the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Trump attempted a coup d'etat by submitting false electoral college votes to the National Archives and, when that failed, stochastically and then directly sent a violent mob to stop valid electoral college votes from being counted by Congress in order to illegally remain in power. Federal District Court Judge Tanya S. Chutkan of the District of Columbia was randomly selected to oversee the criminal proceedings. She set a March 4, 2024 trial date and handled pretrial motions, including what evidence should be allowed in, any gag orders, the language of questionnaires for potential jurors, what defenses should be allowed, and so on. Trump filed a pretrial motion at the district court level, arguing he had absolute immunity from prosecution, and therefore the criminal charges. Chutkan denied that motion, but put all proceedings on hold pending the outcome of his appeal. Now, you might be asking, what does this have to do with the war in Ukraine? And the answer is almost everything. Donald Trump, as the likely Republican nominee for the 2024 presidential election, has made it very clear that he would leave Ukraine to its fate. Don't forget that one of his 2016 campaign managers, Paul Manafort, worked for disgraced Russian puppet and former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. After Yanukovych was forced from power during the 2014 Maidan Revolution, he fled to Russia, and Manafort continued to work for Russian oligarch and Kremlin gremlin Oleg Deripaska. Within a month, Russia invaded the Donbass, that is, parts of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, and annexed Krim, better known by its wrong name, Crimea. Trump and Manafort changed the 2016 Republican Party platform to remove providing lethal security assistance to Ukraine. And for what it's worth, the Republican Party doesn't even have a platform anymore. Although it was overshadowed because of the advent of COVID, Trump was first impeached for illegally withholding Javelin anti-tank weapons from Ukraine and extorting President Zelensky. He ordered the Pentagon not to send Javelins while secretly demanding Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and his surviving son, Hunter. Hunter Biden had been on the board of Ukrainian energy company Burisma at the time. Spifflicated simpleton and Trump surrogate Rudy Giuliani traveled to Kyiv many times to fabricate evidence of Biden's supposed corruption. David Frum said it best in an article in The Atlantic, quote, "Ukraine's expendability to congressional Republicans originates in the sinister special relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Ukraine equals enemy of Trump. Abandoning Ukraine equals proof of loyalty to Trump." As Trump nears renomination by his party in 2024, the displays of loyalty to him have become ever more obligatory for Republicans. Solidarity with Ukraine has faltered as support for Trump has consolidated. Make no mistake, if Republicans in Congress abandon Ukraine to Russian aggression, they do so to please Trump. Every other excuse is a fiction or a lie. Unquote. This brings us back to the trial of Trump. Removing Trump as a political actor removes an existential threat to Ukraine. However, most mainstream media coverage of the trial lacks context and nuance. As I listened to the oral arguments in the Court of Appeals, more on that in a minute, I noticed Russian propaganda had made its way into the courtroom. Russian propaganda has infiltrated our society in such pernicious ways, and US institutions, especially the media or Fourth Estate, are doing little to nothing to combat it. News consumers are left to their own devices, allowing the Russians to divide and conquer. "85% of the KGB budget during the late Soviet Union was spent on disinformation operations. KGB agents' annual reviews accounted for how many fake news stories they generated and successfully propagated. The goal of these fake news stories and propaganda was to use our freedom of speech against us and undermine the free world, especially the United States." Let's start with a conspiracy theory that was wildly successful. In 1983, the KGB used the Indian magazine Patriot to claim that the US invented HIV in what it called Operation Infection. The Soviets preferred to place their conspiracy theories in third world newspapers and news outlets, then direct them to the target country. In this context, the target was the United States. After the KGB planted the seed, the Stasi, or East German Secret Police, paid two married East German biologists, Jakob and Lily Segal, to publish a 53-page pamphlet titled AIDS, Its Nature and Origin, using technical scientific jargon that supposedly proved the AIDS virus was created at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. The Segals, posing as French scientists to hide their origins, presented their report at the August 1983 Summit of the Non-Aligned Movement, a forum used by Third World countries during the Cold War to advocate for their interests. In 1986, 103 countries belonged to the movement, including 51 African nations, where AIDS was raging. The Segals stated in their concluding remarks in the pamphlet, quote, "The first appearance of AIDS exactly coincides with the opening of a P4 laboratory at Fort Detrick, taking into account the incubation period. This is also indicated by the fact that the spreading of AIDS to the world emanated from New York, a city in the neighborhood of Fort Detrick. The assumption that AIDS is a product of the preparation of biological warfare can therefore quite plainly be expressed." Unquote. The words assumption and therefore are spelled wrong, by the way. Despite the fact that Fort Detrick is 250 miles or 400 kilometers from New York City, it ended up on the nightly news with Dan Rather on March 30th, 1987, reaching tens of millions of Americans.
A Soviet military publication claims the virus that causes AIDS leaked from a U.S. Army laboratory conducting experiments in biological warfare.
Part of the success of Operation Infection was due to journalists' lack of training in reading technical documents and their inability to recognize junk science. Another reason was simple journalistic laziness. No one at CBS bothered to track down an expert to see if it was plausible before reporting on it. This happens all the time, including reporters who cover the law. According to a July 2023 paper in the Journal of Democracy, between 80 and 90% of top-level officials in the Soviet Union retained their posts in what became the Russian Federation. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB split into two organizations, the FSB, Russia's internal security service, and the SVR, its external intelligence service. In practice, the SVR and FSB compete with each other, and their operations overlap outside of Russia. Since the KGB remained largely intact, so did its disinformation operations. Prior to becoming dictator for life, Putin, a former KGB officer who was on the ground during the reunification of Germany, led the FSB. Heading the security services in Russia remains one of the most common stepping stones to building a base of power among the Russian elite and eventually taking control of the state to this day. In a sense, today's Russia is little more than an organized crime syndicate masquerading as a nation-state and wannabe empire. Little suggests the FSB's allocation of resources has changed either. The Kremlin still views its disinformation active measures as one of the best returns on investment for prosecuting hybrid war against a world dominated by the United States and its allies. So, disinformation operations continue unabated. The Obama birther conspiracy originated in Russia, was adopted by Donald Trump, and forced Obama to release his birth certificate showing he was born in Hawaii, and therefore was eligible to be president. You can still access both the original long-form birth certificate and a more recent copy issued by the Hawaii Department of Health on Obama's archived White House website. In 2014, Russia falsely claimed Ukrainians shot down MH17 over occupied Donetsk when, in fact, it was shot down by a Russian Buk anti-aircraft missile operated by the Russian military. In May 2016, the Russian government organized protests and counter-protests outside mosques in Texas using Facebook. According to the FBI, dozens of such rallies were organized across the United States in 2015 and 2016 by the now exploded and dead warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, all in an effort to divide Americans. On July 27, 2016, Trump publicly requested Russia to find emails missing from Hillary Clinton's private email server from her time as Secretary of State.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
That same day, Russian hackers sent phishing emails to Clinton's private server, using the same hacking technique that allowed them access to her campaign manager's emails, which were disseminated through WikiLeaks throughout the 2016 campaign. Although the public didn't know the exact details at the time, anyone with a brain could clearly see Russia was actively or trying to actively interfere in the US election. The media abjectly failed in its duty to report on it. A study in the Columbia Journalism Review found that coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails exceeded that of all of Trump's scandals combined. By creating a false equivalence between the email scandal and Trump's many, many scandals, the media helped Russia achieve its goal of undermining American trust in a key American institution. And it worked beyond their wildest dreams. In October 2023, Gallup released survey results showing Americans' trust in mass media is at an all-time low. Just 32% of Americans trust in mass media, a great deal or fair amount, with a record 39% claiming they have no trust at all. And you can count us among that 39%. The remaining 29% don't have very much trust in the media. Democrats tend to be more trusting in the media than Republicans, but the gap between Democrats and Republicans is narrowing. Only 58% of Democrats have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly, compared to Republicans' 11%. Independents stand at 29%. We expect the gap to narrow even further as legacy mass media continues to fail the American public by writing inaccurate, clickbaity headlines, failing to balance and contextualize news, failing to provide nuance instead of sound bites, outrage farming, and featuring unqualified commentators to comment on everything from the war in Ukraine to the election to the Hamas-Israel war. In December 2023, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines partially declassified the intelligence community's assessment of foreign influence on the 2022 midterm elections. China and Iran have adopted Russia's playbook in election meddling. Russia's goal was to undermine US support for Ukraine during the midterm elections. Russia largely targeted the Democratic Party because they, rightly in my opinion, perceived President Biden as unifying Western allies in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They also targeted Republicans perceived as anti-Russia, like Liz Cheney. The Russian military even waited until the day after the midterms to withdraw from half of Kherson in order to deny Democrats a perceived win during election week. Moving away from hack and leak operations, the Russians focused on amplifying narratives that would divide US society along ideological lines using traditional family values, like anti-LGBT, anti-secularism, anti-intellectualism, and anti-abortion. They conducted extensive sociological surveys to make sure that their messaging would work. For example, Russia targeted left-leaning audiences with the message that supporting Ukraine would risk war with Russia. They targeted males over 40 who are interested in right-wing conservatism with the message that multiculturalism and, quote, leftist ideals drove the United States into a crisis. And they targeted white and Latino lower-middle-class Americans who support family values, and Americans who felt aggrieved by purported social media censorship that reaffirmed this conspiracy theory. Moscow promoted false narratives that the Bidens were involved in corrupt dealings in Ukraine. The Kremlin also pushed personas favoring draconian immigration laws. And now, we find Ukraine aid blocked because of an immigration dispute. Russia and Trump continue to undermine US institutions by spreading the big lie that the 2020 election is stolen. In 2022, Kremlin actors targeted the Democratic Party in Arizona, where Republican gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake claimed her loss was due to election fraud.
You all saw what happened in Arizona, right? I mean, there's no hiding it, there's no sugarcoating it. They stole that election, the entire world saw it. The crime was committed in broad daylight on November 8th. They sabotaged Election Day. You know why? Because the America First movement is so massive and so powerful, and what we have in Arizona is so big, they couldn't just steal it in the middle of the night. They couldn't just change up the machines. They had to pump in hundreds of thousands of phony ballots with no chain of custody, and that still wasn't enough. They had to sabotage Election Day. On Election Day, they intentionally printed the wrong image on the ballot, knowing that our people were showing up on Election Day, and that caused the tabulators to jam. It caused 4-hour lines, and guess where they did this? 60% of the voting centers in the Republican areas. It was so bad that I told my team, find me the most liberal part of town, and that's where we're going to go to vote. And we did. We drove across town. We went to a liberal part of town. I waited 0 minutes. I got right in. We printed it out. The machines were working, and I voted. But in the Republican parts of town, people waited 4 and 5 hours. They left the line. Many of them didn't vote, and many of them, their vote was spit out and put into a drawer 3. It is despicable what they did, and I will not stand by and let these bastards get away with it. Never. They thought we would just, crawl away and maybe come back later and try it again. No, we're tired of doing that. We need a few fighters in this world, and they mess with the wrong fighter. And I know they mess with you guys too, and we're all fighters and we're in this together. So we're living in some pretty dangerous times, as we all know. And we may not be taking bullets and arrows right now, to be honest. Well, actually, we had an event in Iowa, and they tried to somebody threatened to drive their Jeep through our event. We had 500 people at a rally in Iowa. So they kind of are trying to kill us.
Now a declared candidate for this year's Senate race, she continues to spread lies about her loss. Her lawyers have been sanctioned by a court for filing lies in their pleadings, and she's facing 3 defamation lawsuits by the people she accused of manipulating the ballot count, including Maricopa County Republicans. Still, in 2022, Russian influencers amplified conspiracy theories that Ukraine invested in FTX, a notorious Ponzi scheme run by Sam Bankman-Fried. The Russians claimed that Ukraine used FTX to funnel money to the Democrats. Ukraine did no such thing, and SBF gave to both Democrats and Republicans. Remember Tara Reid? She accused President Biden of sexual assault, and then fled to Moscow and gave a boring, hours-long press conference with Russian state media Sputnik.
When I got off the plane in Moscow for the first time in a very long time, I felt safe, and I felt heard, and I felt respected. And that has not happened in my own country. I'm not going to be intimidated, bullied, or silenced. I'm going to speak out, and I'm willing to speak under oath about the corruption I witnessed, about the crime I experienced. I'd like to apply for citizenship in Russia from the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and hopefully Maria Putin can help me with that from the State Duma. I don't know what will happen with that, but I do promise to be a good citizen, and I promise to move forward with my life in a positive way. I wanted to remind people at home in America how our history is being rewritten in schools and things. It's really disheartening. It's very sad that America has chosen the wrong side of history in this moment and are actually funding, extremists and Nazis. So I encourage Americans to do their own bit and try to be tourists, to try to find out more about Russian culture and not fall into what the elites are trying to push with the propaganda of Russophobia and trying to create an enemy where there is none.
Even National Security Council spokesman John Kirby was forced to acknowledge she might have been part of active measures.
I would let this prospective Russian citizen speak for her intentions and motivation, but whether this particular move by this particular individual is some sort of Russian information op or propaganda campaign, I just don't know.
Intelligence journalist Michael Isikoff noted Republicans were eager to use her until she fled to Moscow.
Just a few months ago, some Republicans were talking about bringing her to Capitol Hill to testify about her allegations. I think it's pretty much off the table at this point and she says, I'm prepared to testify under oath. To who? Russian Duma? Look, clearly this is a propaganda windfall for Putin. I mean, it's a bit crude, but to have this woman who makes serious allegations against the president of the United States, who is backing Putin's sworn enemy in Ukraine, the Kremlin's want to do as much as they can to bring out her story, to let her make her claims.
She also showed up in the intelligence community's report as a Russian election interference operation. Russia, through Prigozhin-linked entities, was pushing her false allegations in the run-up to and following the 2022 midterms. Her false claims were widely reported by the mass media, and very few questioned whether she was doing the bidding of a foreign power. Looking ahead to 2024, Russia is helping Trump push the lie that Biden is responsible for trying to put him in prison and that the 2020 election was stolen. The truth is, Trump broke the law, and multiple courts have found he engaged in insurrection. The intelligence community expects Russian attacks on our elections to increase exponentially, since Russia tends to interfere much more in presidential campaigns. So what can we do about this in this critical election year? We can look to countries living near Russia who are used to this type of interference. They're often testing grounds for new active measures tactics. Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and Poland have all been down this road before, and they're resilient. They have primetime shows dedicated to debunking Russian conspiracy theories, and their populations are very cautious and aware of Russian meddling. Their media is savvy, as are their people. Media literacy is taught beginning at an early age and lasts throughout secondary education. For its part, the United States Department of State's Global Engagement Center issued guidance to combat Russian propaganda in August 2020, although it hasn't been widely disseminated and isn't widely known. The guidance outlines the 5 pillars of Russian propaganda. The first is official government sources, like the Kremlin's website or Russian embassy social media posts. The second pillar is state-funded global messaging, like RT, Sputnik, RIA Novosti, and Russia-funded think tanks. Third is cultivation of proxy sources, including Russia-aligned outlets with global reach, local language outlets, witting and unwilling proliferators of Russian narratives, and foreign state narrative amplification. Think Iran, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and South Africa. The fourth pillar is the weaponization of social media, used to infiltrate domestic conversations, inflame domestic discord, and undermine faith in institutions, and organize or amplify domestic protests. The last pillar is cyber-enabled disinformation, which includes hack-and-release campaigns. Think WikiLeaks. Website capture and denial of service attacks, cloning legitimate websites, disseminating forgeries of legitimate information, and disrupting official sources of information through cyber attacks on government or media websites. Links and graphics to all these sources can be found on our Substack and Patreon. With all this in mind, let's turn to cover the oral arguments in Trump's absolute immunity appeal. Leaving the courthouse, Trump reiterated the claim that he's absolutely immune from prosecution. In the federal U.S. court system, an appeals court can generally only review a judge's order after it has the full record from the trial court, also known as the district court. Appeals are heard by a panel of 3 randomly selected judges in that judicial circuit, which is just a geographical area, who serve on the appeals court. The appeals court judges you'll hear from are Judge J. Michelle Childs, a Biden appointee, Judge Florence Pan, a Biden appointee who filled the vacated seat left by now Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson when she was elevated to the Supreme Court, and Judge Karen Henderson, a George H.W. Bush appointee. Trump's attorney, Dean John Squire, is recognizable through his raspy voice because, unfortunately, he has a cold, and I'm really sorry for the sound quality here. James Pierce appeared for special counsel Jack Smith and the United States Department of Justice. During an appeals hearing, the judges ask questions of the lawyers representing both the appellant, that is, the party who appeals, and in this case, it's Donald Trump, and the appellee, that is, the party who defends the lower court's decision because it's in their favor, in this case, the U.S. Department of Justice. First, judges have to establish what's called jurisdiction, which just means whether they're authorized through a law passed by Congress or a power described in the Constitution, because if they're not authorized to hear the case or the appeal, the proceedings are dismissed and that's the end of it. Appeals courts can only find error in a matter of law or how the law was applied, like if a lower court judge gave the wrong instructions to the jury, which led them to inappropriately convict a defendant. Another example in an error of law is if the lower court judge allowed evidence to be presented when it shouldn't have been. Appeals court judges can't determine errors in matters of fact, such as whether someone stole $5,000 versus $7,500. Since Trump's argument rests so heavily on constitutional law, you'll hear references to the Articles of the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch through Congress. Article 2 creates the executive branch through the office of the presidency. And Article 3 creates the judicial branch through the judiciary and the Supreme Court of the United States. Each article defines the duties and powers of each branch of government. Congress creates laws and authorizes spending. The president makes sure the laws are implemented and enforced, and the judiciary interprets the law. The president can pardon people for violating the law and, subject to approval by the Senate, appoint Supreme Court justices. Congress can impeach and convict a president or officer of the United States or an Article 3 judge for treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors, and the judiciary can find laws passed by Congress or actions taken or policies adopted by the president to be unconstitutional and inviolate them. Article 3 is almost like an afterthought in the text of the Constitution itself. Since the founders didn't leave much of a record during the Constitutional Convention back in 1787, historians and lawyers rely heavily on a series of newspaper publications from 1787 and 1788 called the Federalist Papers. Written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison under a pseudonym, they help lawyers and historians understand the intentions of those who drafted the Constitution. Let's listen in to the oral arguments, and I will interrupt to explain what's going on in as plain English as I can.